Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema podcast YouTube channel. You can also listen to us on Spotify, Apple, and Google. And you can also check us out at the Sonic Cinema Patreon at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you'll get brief write-ups on older movies that I've seen for the first time, early access to recent film reviews, as well as deeper dives. Last month I talked a little bit about film noir in retrospect, in context of the films I watched for last month's Noirvember. In October, I did a deep dive on the directorial work of Clive Barker and how it compares to his written word. And this month, I'm basically going to wrap things up by discussing my 10 favorite films that I watched for the first time this year, as well as my 5 favorite rewatches. I felt like that was kind of an easy thing to wrap up the year with, and that's going to be at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. I'm pleased to be joined once again by Matthew Saliba. He's been on the podcast several times before, and as is the case, we're going a little bit off the beaten path. Last year was a lot about kaiju films and Godzilla. Earlier this year, we talked about Sergio Leone's Man with No Name trilogy and comparing it to Kurosawa's Yojimbo and Sanjuro. Today, we are talking about a filmmaker that ranks as Matthew's favorite filmmaker of all time, Jess Franco. And to prepare for this, I've started watching some of Franco's work for the first time. And Matthew, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on the show. Believe it or not, this is as enthusiastic as I am about kaiju. That's nothing compared to Jess Franco. I've really been looking forward to this.
So I'm going to let Matthew kind of drive the conversation here because of the fact that he's more familiar with Franco than I am. Like I said, this was so I first started watching Franco's films in preparation for this podcast. I watched the 3 films that we're going to talk about today, as well as a couple of other ones we're not really going to talk about. Matthew, how did you first get into Franco's work?
Well, it was all thanks to a friend of mine named David Zuzello. So this might be dating me, but back in the days, there used to be things called message boards. Where people would talk about films and and inevitably get into fights. Not unlike Facebook, actually. So it's really. But so there was a message board called Horror. I can never pronounce that word, but Horror you know what I'm saying, Horror HQ, mm-hmm. And it was run by Zuzello. And this guy was an encyclopedia of genre cinema, and in particular, European genre cinema. So he would always be mentioning names and certain films with this fevered passion. And it was really contagious because a bunch of us who were friends on the board started taking him up on his recommendations, which sort of led to the whole damn you, Davey Z movement whenever he would recommend something that wasn't terribly good. But Jess Franco is one of the many filmmakers he would talk about, and eventually, when they started selling these films on DVD, back when DVD first started, I jumped on the bandwagon and started exploring some of his work. And I have to admit, in the world of cult cinema, some people would say cult cinema in of itself is an acquired taste. But in the world of acquired taste, Jess Franco is an acquired taste. So, and then, of course, there's Jean Rollin, who's an acquired taste in a world where Jess Franco is an acquired taste, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, he's now I couldn't say for sure. I want to say yes, but he may very well be one of the most prolific filmmakers ever, depending on who you Who You Trust. He's directed anywhere between 140 to 215 feature films. Now, according to Stephen Thoreau, wrote the definitive tome on the work of Jess Franco, because he actually watched all the films he's ever made. I believe Jess Franco has directed, produced, acted, and wrote, did the music for approximately 173 feature films. The only other filmmaker that comes close that I could think of is maybe Takashi Miike, who did Ichi the Killer Audition. I think he recently crossed the 100 film mark, so he's getting there. And there's another filmmaker, a woman named Doris Wishman, who would direct these sexploitation films well into her 90s when she eventually passed on. So, and she, I think, hit the 100 film mark as well. But yeah, I think Jess Franco is by far the most prolific filmmaker. And the best way to describe him, and this is kind of what I like to say to people who are looking to get into him, is that he's sort of the the David Bowie of cinema. And what I mean by that is, much like how David Bowie never stuck to one certain sound, he continually reinvented himself, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And Jess Franco is a lot like that. And I think when you have a filmography that's in the triple digits, it's probably easier to be a David Bowie than, let's say, if you were a Sergio Leone when you only directed 7 films. That's not much room to sort of chip your style too much. So like when Franco began in the 60s, he started by directing these beautiful Gothic horror films that wouldn't look out of place in the Universal Horror Library or under the tutelage of Val Lewton. And they're really beautiful to look at. And then after that, he sort of went into the what I call the spy-fi genre, which is spy and science fiction. And he specialized a lot in that. Probably one of the more notable films he did was a film I think you watched, which I guess we're not going to really talk about too much, but he did a film called The Girl from Rio, a wonderfully subversive take on the genre. And in many respects, almost like the forerunner of a film like The Naked Gun, because there's so many physical gags. Like one of my favorite thoughts is when there's this girl swimming in the pool, and then the phone rings, and she just takes it, and then she continues to swim while she's got the phone on her. So little things like that. That's another thing about Jess Franco, is that he was very much ahead of his time in a lot of different respects. For example, now this is a bit of a contentious note but and we can maybe get into that a little later, but in Italy, there's a genre called the giallo. I don't know if you've heard of that, but they're basically these whodunit murder mysteries that are set in Europe with beautiful locations, Baroque cinematography, and sometimes inappropriate music. And now, because that's a uniquely Italian genre, Mario Bava is generally regarded as being the inventor of that genre with his film Evil Eye in 1963. When you consider how the term kaiju, which used to be a Japanese thing, but now is sort of this catch-all term that people use to describe any sort of giant monster movie, if we're going to go with that, then technically the giallo, Italians weren't the only ones who made gialli. And in many respects, I feel that Jess Franco's film in 1962, the sadistic Baron von Klaus, was very much the first giallo, because it was a murder mystery, and there were a lot of shots that Mario Bava kind of employed in his own films. So yeah, Jess Franco invented a lot of genres. As far as the portrayal of women on film, he was also very much ahead of his time, because women weren't obviously given the kind of leeway to create interesting characters the way they are. But that's not necessarily the case in Jess Franco's films, because I would argue that some of his best work involved women in strong leading roles. So he's very much ahead of his time in that. One thing, though, as you could probably imagine, when you have a filmography in the triple digits, your batting average isn't going to be 1,000. It might not even be 500. I've managed to whittle his filmography down from 173 to maybe 12 or 15 films that I would really recommend. But yeah, with all the films that he's made, I feel like it's very important that your first experience with Jess Franco is a good one, because his career is kind of divided into two different categories. You've got like the golden age, which is 1962 to 1973. And then you have like the silver age from 1973 to about 1983. And then after that, he sort of kind of became a full-on X-rated filmmaker for most of the 80s. And I feel like, if your first experience with Jess Franco is a film called A Butt Crack for Three, you may not, which is true. That's actually one of the films that he's made. Anyway, so if that's your first experience with Jess Franco, you may not be inclined to want to discover the rest of his work. But the good thing about it is that there's so many DVD and Blu-ray labels out there that have put out a lot of his seminal films that you could theoretically study his work in chronological order. You might not be able to watch all 173 films, but you can certainly catch about 40 or 50. And from there, I think you'll find that the journey that he goes on as a filmmaker is really, really interesting, because he's dabbled in virtually every genre that you can think of, including Star Wars space operas type films. He did a film like in the 80s, I think, called The Sex is Crazy, and it's about an actress who gets abducted by aliens and they impregnate her and all. It's something, to be sure. So anyway, I remember your original question was, how did I get into Jess Franco? It was through my friend Davey Z, and just my general interest in European genre cinema.
What was it about Franco's work that drew you further and further into watching it?
Well, I know you haven't seen all the films that I've made. I know you've only seen Eroticide, but I'm sure, as you could probably gather from Eroticide, I'm very interested in drama and genre, but also infusing that with eroticism. And in many respects, Jess Franco is sort of the godfather of erotic cinema, as far as erotic genre cinema goes, because there are certain erotic films that just sort of cut to the chase, and they're not really the most interesting films. Like Jess Franco basically makes these stylish exploitation in B movies, but he also infuses it with a lot of eroticism, which people weren't really doing at the time. I think when you look at films nowadays, it's almost hard to believe that Hollywood was ever what's the word I'm looking for? Not a virgin, but that Hollywood was ever scared of portraying sex on film. You wouldn't get that impression by watching films nowadays. But for the longest time, the closest thing to a sexy scene you would see in a film is Cary Grant dry kissing a woman for about a second, and so Jess Franco, in many respects, expanded that. Now, part of that is probably because he is a Spanish filmmaker, and I think just in general, the norms and standards in Europe are a lot looser than they are in North America. But I do think that that's something that made him stand out from other filmmakers of his ilk, who were probably more interested in taking established American films and sort of remaking them just to capitalize on the success of them. Whereas Franco was really much his own auteur, really, because when you watch a Jess Franco film, you're watching a Jess Franco film, because especially when you get towards the latter half of his career, where he gets very Zoom crazy. Although I'm sure you kind of saw that a bit in Count Dracula. But yeah, no, when I look at Jess Franco's films, I see films that I could make myself, and we have a lot of similar interests. And so it was one of those things where you start with one film and you just keep going and going, and it really is sort of a rabbit hole, because to this day I'm still finding out new things about Jess Franco. Like recently I just discovered he did a film with Mark Hamill of all people. Mark Hamill and Christopher Lee. It's like a World War II film. So that was kind of interesting. There's always some new stuff coming out about the man.
Yeah, and I will say, if you are interested in watching some of the films that we're talking about here, you can find some of them streaming. I know Tubi TV has a couple of them, especially a couple of the ones that we're going to talk about today are on there, and as well as The Girl from Rio, which Matthew mentioned earlier, that we're not really going to dive talk about in a real in-depth perspective, but I will agree with you as far as that. One of the things that you do recognize early in Franco's work when you start to watch it is the sensual nature of it, is the erotic nature of it, and it is exploitation cinema, but one of the things that's really kind of interesting, especially with one of the films in particular we're going to talk about, which I think is probably my favorite of the ones that I've watched so far, is that it's exploitation cinema, but the sensuality, the eroticism is not really exploitative. I think sometimes it can be, but not necessarily in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and that's a very good point and that's sort of why I gravitate more towards the golden age of his career, like 62 to 73, because I mean, those were some of the films where he had his biggest budgets. He worked with some of the biggest stars that he like Claus Kinski and Christopher Lee, for example. Mm-hmm. I find like after 73, the sex, some of it gets very pornographic. Definitely takes me out of his films, which is a bit of a shame because, I mean, even though the Silver Age and then, of course, the X-rated stuff afterwards isn't what I would necessarily recommend to people if they're looking to get into Franco, but there are a few little gems that are peppered here and there. And it's a shame that they don't really get to stand out as much because there are some really fun ideas. Like he made a film called Lorna the Exorcist back in 1974. And it's a film about a man who makes a deal with the devil for a successful career, but the catch is that when his daughter turns 18, the devil is going to come back to claim her. And of course, the devil is a beautiful woman who spends most of the film in the nude. And so, like, that's a really fun idea for a film. But unfortunately, like the first 20 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, is basically a series of close-ups. And remember, this is the 70s we're talking about, so. Yeah, so, and that's so, you know, I feel like sometimes people, they start off by watching these films and they completely write him off as an X-rated filmmaker, which is really a shame because, you know, as we're going to get into later, I mean, like he has directed some genuinely terrific films and, you know, hopefully by the end of this, we'll have convinced some people to go out and check them out.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and... Let's go ahead and start talking about some of those films. Where would you like to start?
Well, I mean, out of the three here, you know, let's go in chronological order. It's always I always like that best, and I guess that would probably be Venus and Furs. That would be the first one. So yeah, Venus and Furs, 1969, produced by Harry Alan Towers, who was sort of a Roger Corman of Europe. So, you know, he also worked with other directors, but he's probably most famous for his collaboration with Jess Franco. Now, Venus and Furs is obviously a title of a novel that came out in the late 1800s about sadomasochism. And before anyone gets into this film thinking it's an adaptation of Venus and Furs, they may be a little disappointed because other than the title and a couple of character names, there really is no connection to the novel whatsoever. This was like a typical Harry Alan Towers move where he essentially took a title that was popular at the time and essentially just, you know, it's just a name only. Yeah. But for those who aren't deterred by that and are still interested in checking out the film, you are in for a real treat. For me, I really think this is the peak of Franco around this time. He made this film along with, I think, 8 or 9 other movies that year, so keep that in mind. That's pretty impressive. And essentially the story is about a jazz musician named Jimmy Logan, played by James Darren. Now, not to go off track too much, but there is an interesting story about the casting here. So, as you probably gathered, like Venus and Furs, jazz and music is such a big part of the film. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because Jess Franco originally wanted Miles Davis to star as Jimmy Logan. And unfortunately, at the time, the idea, because there would be scenes where Jimmy Logan would be sleeping with Maria Rom's character, Wanda Reed. At the time, the idea of a black actor having sex with a white actress, that would really, my God, can you imagine? Yeah. So anyway, so they did have to change a few things around. So it's sort of an erotic thriller where Jimmy Logan's a musician. He is at his house in the beginning of the film, and then he sort of sees something in the ocean. He runs towards it, and sure enough, he discovers the dead body of Wanda Reed, played by Maria Rom, who was the wife of producer Harry Alan Towers. And so from there, basically the film, we learn that Wanda Reed was a character that Jimmy Logan met at a bar in Istanbul. And Wanda gets into some really heavy stuff with some of the party guests there. And Jimmy Logan, he witnesses it, but he doesn't really do anything. And then without really going, well, I guess we're going to probably talk about spoilers, I guess. This is in like a 2020 film, so it's for people to see. But anyway, so basically, she comes back from the dead, seemingly, and she gets her revenge on all the people who did her wrong. So in some way, it was one of the, again, talking about inventing genres, this is sort of a supernatural rape and revenge film. So she does get her revenge on everyone, and there's some really, really... obviously the music is a very big part of this, but like there's some, like the scene basically where Dennis Price, the art dealer, where he's one of the first people who gets killed, and the scene where he gets killed, where he basically has a panic attack after seeing all these beautiful shots of her, that's one of my favorite scenes. It's just so well done, and the music is just so really infuses that scene with a sense of tension and even some sensuality as well. But anyway, so all this to say, she gets her revenge on everyone, but there's a bit of a twist at the end, because at the end we once again find Jimmy Logan alone on the beach, and he sees a body in the ocean, and he runs towards it, and sure enough, it's him. He was dead all along. So when I first saw this movie, I loved everything up until the end. Like when I saw the end, I thought, "Oh, dear God, are you kidding me?" It was all a dream, But and this is the great thing about really good films, is that the more times you watch them, you start picking up little things. And maybe this was just me. I didn't bother looking this up to see if anyone ever had a definitive interpretation of the film. But for me, it's not only a supernatural rape and revenge film, but it's also a Lynchian psychogenic fugue mystery. Now, I know you recently watched Lost Highway, so you might know what I'm talking about. Where, for those who don't know, a psychogenic fugue is a condition where someone who experiences great trauma, for example, like coming home from the war or being a rape victim or something, what they do is, because they cannot relate to this reality, they create a new one in their head where they may or may not become a different person with different values. They may do things in this reality that they didn't have the guts or the courage to do in the real world. So basically, they live in their head, and then eventually reality starts creeping in bit by bit, and then the inevitable happens, where the fugue state just dissipates, and he's back, and then the person is back in reality. So so as far as how this relates to Venus and Furs, so if you may recall, when Jimmy meets, because I think Jimmy's playing at a club in the beginning of the film, and then at some point Wanda pays him a visit, and then he follows her somewhere, and we never really see the end of that. But I sort of interpreted that as Jimmy Logan was the first person she killed, because he was there, he witnessed everything, but he didn't do anything about it. So she naturally killed him before she went to all the other guys. But what was I going to say? So yeah, she must have killed him before, and I think the reason why that he follows her this whole time is that he has always harbored this guilt that he never did anything to save her. So he's imagining a scenario in which he's there for her. In fact, in some cases, he even helps her with her revenge. And so that's why. So when I saw that in the film, that just raised the film to another level, because this is not just some sort of, cheap revenge film. I mean, there's also an underlining psychological malaise that's part of this. And I just thought that elevated this film and made it even better than I think anyone involved in the film thought it would be.
Yeah, this is. I'll be honest. Of the 5 films of Franco's that I've watched in preparation for this is my favorite. This was the one that I think to a certain extent. I mean, I don't know if it's the most easily accessible. I think we might get to that a bit later with one of the other films that we're talking about. But this one, even though it has that air of mystery in the same vein of something as David Lynch's Lost Highway, it really is accessible to watch, and that really became clear rewatching it this morning before we were recording this podcast. I immediately fell back into the rhythms of what this film is doing, and really, and the narrative, the story feels very fragmented, but it also moves very well. And part of that is the style. This is, you mentioned, this is very much a film noir type detective story in a way. I mean, in the same vein of movies like Detour, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I never really thought of it like that, but yeah, I suppose it could. There's definitely some elements of noir, especially with the voiceover. And actually, now that I'm just thinking about it, I don't know why, but for some reason I'm getting sort of visions of oh Jesus, what was that film? Oh my God, I'm gonna kick myself for not knowing this. It was a Sunset Boulevard. That's it. Yeah. With the whole voiceover and like with the dead body in the water at the beginning. So it wouldn't, and that's the thing about Jess Franco too, because sometimes I get the impression that people think he's sort of like this outsider artist, or someone who's had no classical training in film. Like it was just someone you gave a camera to, and you were surprised that he came out with a feature film. But no, he is classically trained, and especially around this period, he would often be very referential to art films at the time. Like another film I kind of got a bit of a vibe from while watching Venus in Furs was La Dolce Vita by Fellini.
Yeah.
Particularly in the scene where Olga, the fashion photographer, when she first meets Wanda, and like Paul Muller is like throwing the feathers on them, and you've got like that felt like something straight out of a Fellini film. And I mean, like, he did also make a film in 1968 called Succubus, which in many respects is like a giant in-joke about art house movies, which doesn't necessarily make for the most entertaining watch, but I mean, if you've seen some of these films before, you'll get a kick out of it. So, and also, I forgot to mention this, sorry to get off topic here, but another thing about Jess Franco is that he's very well regarded in his country of Spain. He was actually awarded the Lifetime Achievement Goya Award, which is the equivalent of the Academy Awards. And this was presented on TV, so it's not like when David Lynch got an Oscar and it wasn't part of the official broadcast. You know what I mean? So like he is held in high regard. So it's not so that's why. So when you mention the film noir, it's like, yeah, of course, this is a film noir in some respects too. So there we go. Another thing that to learn about this movie.
Yeah, and the music adds to that as well. The fact that it's the fact that the music is very much jazz infused, and I mean even the title song Venus and Furs that pops up when a murder is taking place is one of those things where that's another thing that gives me the noir sensibility out of this film. I will say you mentioned Klaus Kinski. He is in this. It's really, I think this is probably one of my first times it's not my first time, but it's one of my first times really seeing him away from Herzog.
Yeah.
And I mean, those are obviously the collaborations that he's most known for, but it's fun. It's interesting to see how striking of a personality and how striking of a physical presence he can bring to a movie.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we'll talk more about this when we talk about Count Dracula, because he's got a pretty famous role in that. But yeah, much like how Toshiro Mifune is always going to be associated with Akira Kurosawa. Yeah, Klaus Kinski is definitely a Herzog actor. But yeah, as far as European exploitation films go, I think it was an unwritten rule that you had to have a 5-minute cameo by Klaus Kinski to. He was in a lot of this stuff, and one of the things that really jumps out are his eyes. His eyes are so expressive and round, and it wasn't uncommon for him to sometimes change the dialogue to, if anything, because most actors will want more words, but he would actually cut out a lot of his dialogue just to primarily be a physical actor in these types of films. But yeah, obviously, Klaus Kinski was very hot at the time, so having him in the film certainly raised the level of awareness that people might not have had about the movie. But yeah, he's terrific. This film is pretty much sort of a who's who of all the famous actors that Franco was working with at the time. We talked about Maria Rome, we talked about Klaus Kinski, but people like Dennis Price, Paul Muller. These are character actors who would appear in a lot of his work, and include the films that we're going to talk about a little later. But no, I'm happy. I'm happy you enjoyed it, and again, most people that I show the film to really get a kick out of it. Some are kind of thrown by the ending, but yeah. But on the other hand, I do think there's a lot to get out of this. Another thing I really like about this movie and about Jess Franco films in general are the locations, because that's the thing. When you watch American or Canadian films, sometimes the locations just sort of bleed into one because, you kind of live there. So it's not as exotic as, let's say, a temple in Istanbul might be. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that lends a lot of the charm of these movies. The fact that they're shot on location, these aren't sets. And it's funny because I think there's a shot of in the film when Jimmy Logan is chasing Wanda Reed, he's chasing her down this sort of it's outside. It's this little hallway with pillars on either side, and I think that is that location has been used in probably a couple dozen of Jess Franco's movies, because he does have a tendency to shoot at the same place again and again. Another thing I wanted to mention too about Jess Franco, and especially about this film, is that one of the ways that Jess Franco, one of the reasons why he's credited with directing so many movies is because sometimes his films would often get released in different cuts and different titles. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, Venus and Furs, in Europe, I believe it's known as Paradoxum, or I think that might be something like that. Yeah. And there are a couple of different cuts that are circulating around. But another thing he would also do is kind of remake the same film a few times. So, for example, Venus and Furs, in many respects, served as the basis for a remake he would make the year later called She Killed in Ecstasy, which uses the same cast as Vampiros Lesbos. And I believe it might have been shot at the same time as that film. Mm-hmm. So that's a Jess Franco trademark, where sometimes if you're going to buy one of his films, you may want to look and see if there are alternate or better versions. So that's sort of how he kind of gets up to 173.
Yeah. And the thing that I really like about this one is there is the narration. I wasn't, admittedly, I didn't think much of the performances the first time I saw it. I thought, they're fine for what the movie is, but the visual storytelling is ultimately what carries it. And I still think that's the fact, but the second time watching it, I appreciated the way this narration helps drive the story a bit more, and the performances really I think they do serve a particular purpose in the film as far as putting you in this sense of in this sort of sense of film noir where it and mystery and having the main character be somebody who is very sort of off balance by what he's experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it almost makes me want to watch the film again now, thinking about the film noir connotations. But yeah, and I also think, given that this is a bit of a surreal film as well, I do think it kind of helps a bit having that narration ground the film in a kind of reality that people can relate to. But yeah, it's. I'm trying to think if there's something else I wanted to mention about this film, but yeah, I think we. Oh, yeah, there is one thing. So you probably noticed that there was a lot of footage of Carnival from Rio.
Yeah.
So if you watch a lot of his films, particularly from '68 to '69, I believe that one of the films he shot one of the films that he made. I think it was a women in prison film called 99 Women. And I think he just shot like a bunch of stock footage of the Carnival, and I think this same footage actually shows up in a few of his films around this period. So it kind of made me smile when I saw it because you could tell that it's kind of being used to pad out the film a little bit, which it didn't really need, to be honest. But anyway, but yeah, I just thought that was funny. So in case you were wondering, yeah, that's like stock footage he's used from other movies.
Yeah, and Venus in Furs is available on Tubi, by the way. For those of you who are listening, it is well worth a watch. It's 86 minutes. It's really quick. It doesn't. One of the things that I appreciate about Franco watching his films is he doesn't waste a moment when it comes to his storytelling. He's a very economical storyteller. And that's something that's very clear in at least the three films that we're going to discuss, as well as others.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I mean, I do think some of that also is the fact that when you're shooting 8 or 9 films a year, you can't afford the luxury of a Stanley Kubrick style production where you can do 6 takes,
Yeah.
But again, I do think that gives his films a sense of urgency, which is another charm of the movie too. And again, that's something that and maybe you can relate to this too, because I know your background as a musician, but I'm sure I'm sure you can relate to the fact that sometimes you're under a deadline, or you may not have all the tools or the resources that maybe someone working in Hollywood might have, and so I feel like as a filmmaker I can relate to that, and that's when I loved Star Wars and stuff like that, but I mean like I've said, I think before, like if I tried to make Star Wars, that my attempt at making Star Wars would make Turkish Star Wars seem like Star Wars. Whereas when I look at Jess Franco's films, and this isn't a bad thing either, I'm not saying like I'm settling for the Franco aesthetic because I can't achieve the Star Wars aesthetic. It's an aesthetic that's worth talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I feel like this is probably why a lot of DIY filmmakers who have an interest in horror and I guess eroticism kind of relate to, or are kind of drawn to him, because again, like he's one of the few filmmakers who he's a filmmaker who sort of spearheaded the movement, but not only that, but had a career that lasted up until his death in 2013. So he proved that this successful formula, and if done properly, you could not only make your budget back, but you can also, hopefully entertain and maybe even enlighten some audiences in the process.
Yeah, that is definitely true about his work. I mean, even something that feels more exploitative or just very kind of loopy. I mean, Girl from Rio, I will admit, it's like that movie is just completely bonkers in a lot of ways. I mean, in some ways for me that I enjoyed, in other ways where I wasn't really as much of a fan of, but I love that it takes the chances that it takes, and it's very much its own thing, and it's one of those things where you always have to appreciate a filmmaker, and one of the things that's interesting about Franco is that you really do sort of, we're going to talk about his horror in a certain degree, where it's like, it's funny because this is more of a film noir, very much more of a genre type film, where it's like when we talk about his horror, like there's something very classical about his horror films and about movies that could, like you said, they could sort of fit in the Universal vein or in Val Lewton's style of filmmaking, or I mean even Hammer's, and that's actually going to be
yeah, you're absolutely right,
and that's going to be an important part when we get to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I guess we might as well start to jump onto that then. So I know the next film what we're going to talk about is Count Dracula from 1970. So if you want, I could maybe just give a bit of background before we get into it. So this was the last film he made for producer Harry Alan Towers. And in many respects, this was sort of a watershed film for him, because you could tell right away going into this movie that the filmmaking style is a lot more personal and a lot more handheld than some of the other work that he did in other films. And you could sort of tell that he was sort of, because again, like around this time, he started doing a lot of experiments in film. And I mean, one film, unfortunately, we're not going to talk about, but a movie he made called The Bear-Breasted Countess, which I call basically the best way to describe that would be if Terrence Malick ever made a softcore lesbian vampire film. That's pretty what that would feel like. Which anyway, like a style like that is so different from, let's say, something like Venus and Furs. So you do kind of see it a little bit with Count Dracula, like right in the opening few shots. I mean, there's, he does get a little zoom crazy, which would become his trademark with other movies. But yeah, so this was the last film for Harry Alan Towers. Many of pretty much the entire cast, and that's made up of Jess Franco regulars. So it's sort of like a swan song for this era of this work.
Mm-hmm.
Also, one of the first films to star Soledad Miranda, who I believe she plays, is it Lucy, or she plays, she's one of the main characters. And Soledad Miranda obviously is most famous for Vampire of Lesbos, which we'll talk about a little later. But yeah, this was one of her first films, and she sort of became a muse for Jess Franco. She starred in about 6 of his erotic thrillers, all of which were shot in 1970. And unfortunately, she had a car accident and passed away in that, and she was really young. And there were a lot of people that were really smitten by her, including Christopher Lee, who has gone on record as saying Soledad was one of his favorite performers to work with, and that she really threw herself into the character. But yeah, and probably the best known, what this film is probably best known as being, is one of the more faithful adaptations of the original novel by Bram Stoker. In fact, I feel like you could tell who's read the novel by their reaction to this movie, because literally, actually, one of my friends on Facebook said, I didn't realize they made a Dracula porn because he's got his 70s stash. And I had to explain to them, it's like, well, no, if you read the original novel, he does sort of start off old and then gradually gets younger, to which my friend responded, so basically it's Benjamin Button. Which is, I guess, one way to look at it. Christopher Lee was also very instrumental in this movie, because he wasn't very happy about the Hammer films he was doing. He felt that they really went far, far away from the source material, which is true, right with the first film that they did. And also that, Count Dracula really almost just became this grunting beast, more as opposed to the eloquent speaker that he is. And so that's why one of my favorite scenes in Count Dracula was a scene that I loved reading in the novel, and we finally got to see it on the big screen, where Dracula gives the speech about the history of his people, and basically the history of his people and why he lays claim to the castle that he has. And it's really such a stirring moment. Like, you could tell, like, Christopher Lee really took this seriously, because he loved the book Dracula. And actually, interestingly enough, on one of the DVD releases of Count Dracula, one of the extras is actually Christopher Lee reading the entire novel,
Oh wow. Okay.
which is a lot of fun. You could probably find that on YouTube. I imagine someone probably put that there. But yeah, so it's a very faithful adaptation. I would say at least the first 30 minutes, it's almost beat by beat what you see or what you read in the novel. I mean, there are a few things that change. I mean, there is a scene, I think, towards the end where some of the characters are in this room with all these animal heads on the wall, and then they sort of like turn towards him and turn towards them. They start making sounds, and I feel like that scene actually predates The Evil Dead. Remember that with the deer and all that?
Yeah.
So that's something that. So anyway, I mean, I don't want to talk too much. I mean, we'll get into a little back and forth, but yeah, I mean, that's basically it. I mean, Count Dracula, last film for Harry Alan Towers, first film with Soledad Miranda, and all in all, I have to say, I mean, for the record, my favorite Dracula film is Nosferatu, just because there has never been a Dracula like Count Orloff.
Yeah.
But I find that I actually prefer this version of Dracula over the Todd Browning one, which, to be honest, I always thought was a little too dry. I mean, I love Bela Lugosi, but between the lack of a score and the very stagey, the way the scenes are staged, and it's very sort of, it's almost like you're watching a play. Right. I feel like this film's a lot more cinematic, and again, the locations are just gorgeous. And also, you do, for fans of the novel who've always whoever wanted to see some of their favorite scenes, including the scene where Dracula's delivering Jonathan Harker to the castle, and they're sort of ambushed by wolves, and like he gets out of the carriage and confronts them. I don't think you've ever really seen that in a Dracula film that I can think of. So yeah, I mean, what did you think of this?
I really enjoyed this, and it was because horror of Dracula, the Terrence Fisher Hammer movie, is one of I'm with you. Nosferatu is my favorite version of the Dracula story, cinematically at least, and but horror of Dracula has always been right up there as well, and a big part of that is the dynamic between Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing as Van Helsing.
Yeah.
And but one of the things that was so interesting to me about this, and it's funny because I think he still had a couple more performances for Hammer as Dracula after this, if I recall.
Yes, he did.
But this does feel very much like Christopher Lee sort of saying everything he had wanted to say, he had left to really say about the character in this movie. It kind of reminds me of reminded me of Logan, actually, the James Mangold that sort of retired Hugh Jackman's version of Wolverine, and it does feel very, and I think part of that was the kind of shock of seeing Dracula portrayed genuinely as an old man, and then seeing the way the character regains his youth. And yeah, Benjamin Button the comparison does make a lot of sense, but yeah, I mean, I thought about this as like old man Dracula to a certain extent. But no,
I'm really glad we had this conversation today, because like between the Venus and Furs being like a film noir and Count Dracula being old man Logan, I honestly want to rewatch these films now with these thoughts in mind. But yeah, that's perfect, because yeah, you could sort of tell, because yeah, he did do a few more Hammer films. I think the most famous one was Dracula AD 1972, where he gets funky. Yeah. But yeah, definitely sort of feels like this is sort of a swan song for him playing this character, and it's almost a shame that he did do other Draculas after this, because this would have been a great way to kind of end time with that character. But yeah, he was definitely, and that's one of the reasons why he signed on to do the film, because right from the get-go, it was made very clear that they want to do an authentic take on the novel that hadn't really been done at that time. And so yeah, I mean, he was very much involved with the writing, and you could tell. I mean, like the character of Dracula is presented with a certain sense of class that and unity that he may not have had, including in some of the Hammer films. But no, I really enjoyed this, and I mean, it was shot in 4:3, like the original Dracula, so I appreciated that. Even though this was 1970 and everyone was CinemaScope crazy at the time, really enjoyed it in the 4:3. And in some cases, I was kind of joking about his overuse of the zoom, but in a 4:3 ratio, like especially like in moments of tension, when he does zoom in, I actually find the 4:3 framing adds a sense of claustrophobia to some of those shots, and makes them a little more tense and unnerving than they might have otherwise been had they been shot 16:9. So yeah, that's just like a filmmaker tidbit that I kind of picked up on. But also, I don't know if you're aware of this guy, but the film was actually, and talk about learning new things all the time. I just learned that this film was edited by Bruno Mattei, who is sort of like the Italian Ed Wood. And oh my God, now that I'm just thinking, that would be a podcast in itself, talking about Bruno Mattei. But that was kind of interesting to see his name on there. Was there anything about the film that in particular that jumped out at you as far as certain themes or?
So I really like the atmosphere in it. I love the music in this film. That's, me as a musician, it's like, and me as a soundtrack buff, that's always going to get me. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about the Franco films that I did see, is that the music is always really interesting, even if I'm not a huge fan of it. Like Venus and Furs, I did love the music, and it's like Count Dracula, I love the music in this as well. But I mean, even the ones where it's like I'm not quite sure even what to sort of make of the music. It's like there's something to be said for that as well, because of it being such a bizarre choice, and such an interesting choice. And I didn't get a chance to rewatch this one before we were talking today, but I will say it's like one of the things that did stand out to me when I watched it in October. I can't say last month because it's now December. I like the way that Van Helsing and Renfield are brought into this story.
Yes.
And I think there's a nice degree of suspense to this.
Oh, I think so too. And again, I mean, sometimes it's hard for, because obviously the 1931 Dracula is synonymous, like it's the film for so many people. So, sometimes you can't help but find yourself comparing it to that movie. But again, I think the fact that this was shot in Europe and again, that this wasn't, these weren't sets like, let's say, the Todd Browning film. So I do think shooting on location really adds so much to it. I mean, like the Carpathian landscape that Arthur travels to get to Count Dracula, like I find in this film particularly, it really does kind of feel like you're there, because every time I've seen this in other films, it was either too stylish, like let's say in the original Nosferatu, to really be able to relate to the location. But that was something that kind of jumped out at me, was the beautiful locations, the castle especially. Again, that was something that he really did very well. And I think this might actually be one of those rare films where we don't see that hallway with the pillars like we did in Venus and Furs. So yeah, I mean, again, I would definitely recommend this. I mean, it is streaming on Tubi, or if you don't want to watch it with ads, I think Amazon Prime has it.
I think you're right.
But I mean, they did. But I think with Severin Films, they put it out on Blu-ray and DVD. And one of the things that's really interesting is that the Blu-ray comes with this experimental documentary about the making of Count Dracula. And it's basically it's almost like a fly on the wall, where we see Franco interact with Christopher Lee, which I thought was really fascinating, because I love getting a behind the curtain look at filmmaking. And so that's a really interesting film. So if anyone wants to add their library, which I would recommend. I mean, this is one of those films where I can confidently say that it's a safe blind buy because it's, at the very least it's Dracula, so you know the story, so at the very least it's not going to come as a surprise. But I do think people are going to be particularly pleased when they see this because it is certainly one of the more I don't know if it's the most faithful, because I think the angry video game nerd of all people did a video on Dracula films, and I think this one scored pretty high as far as faithfulness goes. But I think there are a couple other ones that do go that extra mile. I think one of them was a TV series that aired on BBC.
Yeah, and I would say of the 5 movies that I saw in preparation for this episode, I would say this is probably the most accessible. And I think a big part of that is because of the familiarity of the Dracula story, but also it's just the way that Franco presents the story and the way that you have Christopher Lee, who's so well known in the role. I do think those elements help as well, on top of it just being a very strong version of the Dracula story.
Absolutely. And one thing I think we forgot to talk about was Claus Kinski. So he's in this, and he plays Renfield. And it's and I was mentioning this earlier. I think like originally this role had a lot more dialogue, whereas right now, as it stands now, it's pretty much a silent role where it's more physical. And I think something that Claus Kinski had insisted on, because he wasn't too big on dialogue. He'd rather just explore it through himself. And there's a scene where he's in his padded cell and like he digs up some flies in his toilet. And knowing Claus Kinski, I wouldn't be surprised if he actually did put his hand through the flies, because he strikes me as that kind of actor. But yeah, I mean, how did you find him in comparison to other portrayals of Renfield?
No, I mean, a big part of it is just the natural charisma that Klaus Kinski has. I mean, he's automatically going to be such an interesting performer in a role like that because of the physical presence that he brings to a role, because of, like you said, that very go for broke attitude of, I'm going to literally put my hand in this in a toilet to get at flies. And I think that definitely helps make him stand out. I'm not quite sure if I would say it's my top version of Renfield or that type of character. I mean, it's been a while since I've seen the Todd Browning film, and I haven't seen Bram Stoker's Dracula in forever either. But
right. But if I'm not mistaken, in the Todd Browning film, and I think in a few of them too, don't they tend to combine the character of Renfield and Jonathan Harker?
I'm not sure about the Todd Browning film. Now I do know I think my favorite rendering of the characters is Knock in Nosferatu.
Oh yeah,
because it is such a the fact of the matter is there's no dialogue, and he has to do it all with his face and all with his physical motions, and it's just being such a purely physical performance. It's that stands out more than anything.
Well, yeah. Again, I mean, like I really dug this film, and I think, like you said, I think it. I mean, it's definitely the most accessible out of all the films. Having said that, I mean, I guess as far as availability goes, it's probably the easiest to get your hands on because, like you said, it is on Tubi. I don't necessarily know if it's the. I mean, it's definitely a better entry point to Jess Franco's work than, let's say, a film like Two Female Spies with Flowered Panties, which is a review, by the way. So it's probably a more accessible entry than something like that. But having said that, I mean, this is a film that kind of divides Franco fans because there are some people who don't like the fact that he abandoned the sensuality of his earlier work, because some people kind of feel that this is more of a mainstream film for him, which I suppose it is, given the because up until now, like, he was making adaptations of works by the Marquis de Sade. So Bram Stoker's a much different character. And if nothing else, I think films like this, because every once in a while Franco got tossed a bone where he was given a relatively big budget. Now, please keep in mind, big budget in Europe means different. It means something different.
Yeah.
So I just want people to know, like, because some people might sort of snark when they think of like Count Dracula being a bigger budget film, but it was, and it's proof that when he was given the keys to the kingdom, he could turn out a fairly normal movie. And I think that's what this is. I mean, there are a few of his little quirks here and there, but I do think, like, certainly in comparison to the other two films that we're going to talk about, it's definitely probably most mainstream and probably something that, the average person could get into. But I would certainly recommend maybe starting with The Awful Dr. Orloff from 1962, which is a film that combined elements of Eyes Without a Face with Frankenstein and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I feel like that's a more imaginative film. But again, you have to pay. I think it's the Blu-ray for Awful Dr. Orloff is $30 versus watching Count Dracula for free. So I think that would probably be a better thing for most people. But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. I don't nearly dislike it as much as some other people do. In fact, it's actually one of my favorites of his. It may be a tiny bit on the dry side, but maybe that's the thing about adapting a book too faithfully, is that the scenes that might seem enticing when you read them don't necessarily make the translation to the big screen.
Yeah.
But I mean, all in all, definitely one of the elite 12 films that I would recommend.
Yeah,
for anyone to get into them.
And you mentioned the fact that some people feel like this just doesn't really have that sensuality that Franco was known for, and that's part of the reason why they don't necessarily look at it as highly as some of his other films. It's like it's funny because of the fact that the first Franco film that I watched is one that we're not necessarily going to talk about but it's The Bloody Judge, which is another Christopher Lee movie, and that one does. And I watched that on Prime. I don't think it's available anymore on Prime, but that one is one that has a bit of that sensuality and a bit of that exploitation feel to it compared to something like Count Dracula. Now, I do think Count Dracula is a better movie, and probably, Bloody Judge was a decent introduction to him, but I mean, Count Dracula was very much a more interesting watch overall.
For sure, and I mean, and again, like it's fairly well made too. I mean, I think they're now. I don't know if I'm confusing this film with another one of his films, but I believe at the end of Count Dracula, there's a scene where they push a big boulder onto some folks. I think I don't know if I'm confusing with another movie he did, but there is a scene where I think they push a boulder and you could so tell that it's like a paper mache boulder. So it lands. Like, I think it bounces a little bit. So, there's little things like that. But I mean, I find like, that's something else you'll find about Franco. Like, if you do decide to go down the rabbit hole and discover some of his more experimental stuff, is that, this is a person who doesn't waste a single frame of film. Like, even if shots are out of focus, if the intent is there, I find he'll still include it in the movie, which was something that took some getting used to, because, again, if you grow up on a diet of Hollywood films, I mean, the idea of something being out of focus is just a huge faux pas. You don't do that. Right. But I think that kind of adds a little bit to his films. I mean, it kind of gives it a little bit of a, sort of a little grungy DIY feel to it. I mean, there's certain thoughts in my movies that, for better or for worse, I had to hide certain things because you would see a light here or something like that. So, again, I think that's something as an independent filmmaker I can relate to, and I think a lot of people can when they watch it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of not really wasting a shot and sort of taking every moment as it goes, let's go ahead and transition to the third film that we're going to talk about. Now, this even if you haven't watched this film, even if you aren't necessarily familiar with Franco, chances are if you've been at a video store that has a pretty deep collection of world cinema, of exploitation cinema, chances are you'll recognize this title. So, what is the third film for our list?
Sure. Well, this is a film that I think this is the film that he's really known for. I would say more than else, and I feel like a lot of that soundtrack, but we'll get into that a little later. But yes, the film Heroes Lesbos, and which I don't think I need to translate what that means. I think so this was a film made in 1970, along with like 6 or 7 others, which is really remarkable when you consider he was pumping out all these really top-notch films. But so yeah, this is a very interesting film and kind of a personal one for me too. So we might this might go a little long, but feel free to steer me in the right direction if I'm babbling too much. But so Vampiros Lesbos is the best way to describe it would be almost a companion film to Count Dracula. In fact, it's kind of fun to watch it right after Count Dracula, because even though it's not really a sequel, there are references made to Dracula, and because Soledad Miranda starred in Count Dracula as well, it's you could almost, it's for just for shits and giggles, it's kind of like a fun quasi sequel. But basically, it is an inversion of the Dracula mythos. So, for example, like instead of Dracula being a man, she's a woman. Her name's Countess Nadine. Instead of the film being shot in shadow and fog and low lighting, it's shot out in the daytime with bright sunny skies, beaches. Instead of seeing shots of wolves, for example, ambushing people, you'll see shots of kites in the sky and scorpions and flies and whatnot. So it's really a subversion of that, which I'm very much into subversive art. I like when people take classic themes and sort of flip them on their heads, and that was something that immediately jumped out to me when I watched this movie. The story is basically about a couple named Omar and Linda. One night they're at a nightclub taking in the sights and sounds, and sure enough, they go to a club where the Countess Nadine is performing. And this sort of awakens a sensuality in Linda that we get the impression that was never there to begin with. When we see the couple together, they have very dry and bland and uninteresting sex. They have a very sterile relationship where they sit around saying very sterile things to each other. But when she meets Nadine and she becomes enraptured by her. And Linda, as it turns out, much like Jonathan Harker, she works for Simpson and Simpson, a broker. What would you call that? A realty brokerage, mm-hmm. And is sent out to visit the Countess Nadine because Nadine is looking to move again, much like Dracula, looking to move into the city, and so when she arrives there, they go skinny dipping as you do, and they have a good time, and then eventually, Nadine essentially gets Linda under her power and makes Linda become her sort of disciple. And then it becomes incumbent upon Omar to go on this crusade to save his wife and bring her back to normalcy, which, as the film promotes, is sort of this heteronormative sexuality. Now, I want to get into the subtext because this is really what makes the film stand out for me. But before I do want to stress the importance of subtext. Now, as we're starting to learn in society, sometimes it's not necessarily the words or the actions that the words you say or the actions you do, but sort of it doesn't really matter what you say, because sometimes there's an intent that becomes apparent that you may or may not have wanted to be there. For example, I was once in a movie a long, long time ago called The Return, where I played a zombie, or I played a boy running from home, and then I was attacked by 2 zombies, and I become a zombie. Now, that, sounds like a fun idea in itself, but when the director was doing auditions, as it turned out, the 2 best people for the roles were two black actors. Now, as you could probably imagine, with black zombies attacking this poor white boy, the film took on a subtext that the director had no intention of. It sort of became this sort of a racial thing, and some people even thought it was a little racist. But I mean, like, I read the original script, and I know there was no intent. It just ended up that way because of the casting.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I just want that to be clear that I am going to say a bunch of things about this movie that Jess Franco himself may not have had any intent. Like, this may not have been his intention. For all I know, Franco was not really a misogynist. I mean, he gave women some of the best roles of their careers. I mean, he's always very pro females, which is kind of odd that this film has that sort of subtext, but so be it. So basically, as I mentioned, like, the story of the film is about how Omar has to sort of, because Linda has discovered that she is a lesbian, and she wants to sort of pursue this life with Nadine, but Omar takes it upon himself to try and save his wife and bring her back to the heteronormative lifestyle. Now, this was a film that was very personal for me. Now, not because my wife met a lesbian vampire and became one herself, but the idea of now, at the risk of TMI, I'm not going to go into too many details about the sexuality part, but around 2007, 2008, there were certain aspects of my sexuality that were becoming more and more apparent, and I couldn't deny. And so I sort of came out of the closet a little bit and sort of told people about my real sexuality. And, for every one or two family members or friends that supported me, there were many others who either disowned me completely or felt the need to have to save me and bring me back to what is considered normal. Mm-hmm. And so when I saw this in Vampiros Lesbos, that really hit me. And so in 2008, I did one of the things that you should never do, and that is remake a classic and beloved horror movie. And so, in many respects, that was what kind of kicked off my career, because obviously, if you're going to remake one of the most beloved films, you're going to get attention. And so my version of the film, so this is interesting. So my version of the film was shot entirely in still images, like La Jetée, for example. Mm-hmm. That was a sort of style I was doing at the time with still images. I was working with a photographer, and we had a lot of fun making these movies. And so my version is like 20 minutes short. And the best way to describe it would be sort of like a Cliff's Notes version of Vampiros Lesbos, where, let's say, if you watched the feature film and didn't get what the movie was about, if you were to watch my short, there would be no doubt what the movie's about. Mm-hmm. And that was very interesting, because when I would tour with that film on this festival circuit and talk to people, again, much like the original Vampiros Lesbos, some people were like, well, I'm not really sure I get it. But when I would explain and show how it tied in with the original, people, they respected what I did with my film, and it went on to sort of touch a lot of people. So anyway, I think I kind of got off track a little bit, but long story short, I mean, Vampiros Lesbos, definitely one of the seminal films of his career. I wouldn't personally say it's necessarily his best. And this is, I wouldn't necessarily say it's his best per se, because it's coming at a time where he made Venus in Furs, Count Dracula, Eugenie De Sade, which is his version of Lolita. So I mean, like, all these hits one after the other. I mean, this film isn't entirely. I feel like this is a film that's more interesting conceptually than it may be actually. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you feel, so I'm going to let you talk for a bit.
No, and I think that's actually that's a very fair point. I mean, I would say relatively speaking, in my personal opinion at least. Now, granted, I think all of these movies are good movies, and very good movies and well worth watching. I would say Venus in Furs is probably my top choice, and then Count Dracula is up there as well, and then this is third. Relatively speaking. No, it's funny. I was going back into our Facebook Messenger to see what our back and forth as I was watching this for the first time. And one of the things I said early on was, wow, he's really shooting his shot here as far as exploitation in the beginning of the movie. And you respond, he never wastes a moment, and that's what really made me say out loud that that's one of the things that I really appreciate about him, is that he really doesn't waste a moment of his films. And you know, as much as I admire a filmmaker like Tarkovsky, it's like even I can acknowledge that a filmmaker like him, Stalker's one of my favorite films of all time, but I completely understand people not getting into it because of how much how languid and how very slowly paced that movie is. I completely respect that. And it's like I get that for some people it just doesn't, they just kind of bounce off of that. And it's like that is one of the things that I like about Franco as a filmmaker, is that he doesn't feel the need to he doesn't feel the need to, you know, just stretch things out for the sake of fitting basically everything in the kitchen sink in there. He can get that in a shorter amount of time.
Absolutely. And one of the things, I think you might have mentioned this too when we were talking on Facebook, one of my favorite things about Jess Franco films are his club scenes. Mm-hmm. Because particularly if you get to, there's a film that he made called The Erotic Rites of Frankenstein. And some of the extras in that movie look like they're Xanaxed out of their minds. I don't know. But sometimes I find like in Vampiros Lesbos, like in those club scenes, like you see some people who would in real life they would probably never be at a club like that. It's just right. It feels like, but that's what I love about these films, because like, you know, I find with North American movies, like even the extras look like they just walked off a set of a Parasuco jeans commercial, you know. Whereas in European films, not just exploitation, but even like the artier films as well, like a Tarkovsky, for example, like, you know, if you look at those extras, they look like real people, you know, like that. They're not actors. Those are people that they probably just got off the street and said, "Hey, do you want to watch a nude show for about 10 minutes while we film this?" So yeah, I really so I'm glad you kind of got a kick out of that, because it's always fun to watch who's in those clubs.
Yeah, my exact words were, "Boy, the people in these clubs seem so engaged." And, but that's one of the things that's so great about, because of the fact that it really elevates the surreal atmosphere in these films. And Venus and Furs is kind of the same way, where it really gives it a singular feel to these films that you just don't really see in that type of film often. And that's one of the things that I really like about the way his storytelling operates.
Yeah, I mean, this was definitely one of his more experimental ones. Like, he would go even further than this. Like, this has a fairly linear story, but there are certain other movies that he would make a little after this that really go off the rails and go into that territory where it's really more about the feelings and emotions being conveyed than about any kind of narrative story.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and again, I just, because I was looking at my notes here that I made for the film, but one of the things too, also is that keeping up with the whole subversion is that in this film, Renfield's a woman. Her name's Agra, and you know, you still have like the Dr. Seward character and the sort of Van Helsing type character, which I guess in this case is Omar. Also, something kind of interesting too is that Countess Nadine has a sidekick named Morpho. Now, this is again, Jess Franco's a very self-referential filmmaker, and Morpho is this go-to character that appears in a lot of his movies, actually. And it sort of started with the big bang of the Franco-verse, the awful Dr. Orloff, which is about, like, Morpho is sort of like a Frankenstein type monster. Whereas, you know, here and he sort of plays a similar type of role. So yeah, I mean, again, it is, and that's kind of rewarding, especially if you do try to watch his films in chronological order, because you sort of see the development of a lot of his idiosyncrasies, such as, you know, naming sidekick characters Morpho, There's always a character named Dr. Tanner, for example. That's sort of a ghost. That's something you'll see in some of his other movies. And it was also kind of interesting, just going back, talking about the subtext there. There's a scene at the beginning where Linda's visiting her psychiatrist, and she's sort of telling him the story of Countess Jean. And then you sort of, it's a really great shot too, because like it's an over-the-shoulder shot, and you see the doctor just basically doodling while she's talking, which is sort of which makes me wonder whether, the subtext was somewhat intentional, because, that's a very telling shot, and it's a pretty, you're making a pretty big statement with that. Like, basically the doctor doesn't really care what she has to say, which kind of goes with, the overall, the treatment of women in the film. But, I don't know. I mean, am I completely off the wall with my interpretation? Did you get any of that at all, or?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting about this film is the way that plays with vampire lore, and the fact that the main vampire is a woman. It plays into that. It plays into that subversion of what we're used to in the genre. And I think that's one of the things that's compelling about this movie. And another thing is, this is essentially about erotic desires in the mind. And it's very psychological in that respect. And I mean, that's one of the things that you look at. And really, if we want to, I think you could almost make a beeline with this film to something like Buñuel's Belle de Jour, or even Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, where the idea, the erotic ideas that people have in the mind is really more important than what we see on screen.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because you're right, because again, if I'm not mistaken, I think in the film, like Countess Nadine first makes her appearance to Linda through dreams, through the mind, and that's a very interesting point. Again, I'm so glad we had this talk, because I would have never associated with this with like Eyes Wide Shut. But yeah, you're right. I mean, sometimes we are sort of overcome with our fantasies, and they can either be for the best or for the worst. But I mean, the mind is really it's a really tricky thing, and no matter how much damage you can do to the body, it pales in comparison to what you can do to your mind.
Yeah, this one is not as readily available. You kind of have to go looking for it. I'm fortunate enough to have a video store in downtown Atlanta where they happen to have this available, and so I was able to rent over the summer, and I'm glad that I did. It's definitely a movie where it's like, you look at the title, you definitely think one thing, and there are moments where the film definitely leans into that one thing that you're expecting, but if you look deeper and deeper into it, you're going to see there's more going on with it than just exploitation. And that's one of the things that's so I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about Franco in general, and the way he uses genre, and his appreciation for genre is something that you feel in every frame of the films that he makes, and it's part of what keeps us interested in the films, even if there might be moments where, like for me, Girl in Rio was the one where the narrative really slowed down. Even though it's not that long of a movie, there are moments where it almost becomes glacial to a certain extent. But that's a very different genre. This one still moves very, very deliberately paced, but in a way where the story is always on the move, and that's one of the things that I really appreciate about this film and Franco in general.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear you mention that, because again, much like how some people, they'll look at his more pornographic works and sort of write him off as one type of filmmaker, I do think that for people who are willing to look past some of the some of these things, and if they're willing to give his films a chance, I think they'd be very surprised by what you'd find. I mean, he is one of my. Well, I mean, it's funny because I think you said he was my favorite. He's definitely one of my favorites, but I think someone recently eclipsed him, and maybe that could be another podcast we could talk about, because I feel like this is a filmmaker that you would probably really dig. His name's Jean Rollin, and the best way to describe him would be like he's got the cinematic style of a Tarkovsky with the surrealism of a Jean Cocteau, all by way of Hammer horror. So I feel like you might get a kick out of that. But yeah, no, I mean, one of the reasons why Franco is one of my favorites is that there are some parallels with our careers in that, because like when I started off, I was making kind of like experimental films before I graduated to horror and eroticism, and again, just like so many of the stories, behind the scenes stories. I mean, one of the things that Jess Franco was famous for doing was he would shoot one film like during the day, and then with the same cast and crew, he would shoot another film at night, and without the producer realizing what he was doing. And so sometimes you would have actors be very confused by the lines that they were given, because they didn't seem to relate to anything that they were doing during the daytime. So I think that so that's when you see stuff like that, you could see like how someone's filmography can easily build up.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, again, I made a little list here of some films for anyone who might be interested in exploring more of his work. So these are all from his Golden Age period, which I'm pretty familiar with. I feel like you should probably watch these before you sort of watch some of the sillier stuff, just because you'll probably have a better appreciation of him as an artist. So, I mean, the first film I would recommend was, I mentioned it earlier, The Awful Dr. Orloff. This came out in 1962. Like my friend David Zizzello said, this is the big bang of the Franco universe, where a lot of the artistic choices, a lot of the basically his style sort of began here. And this is probably the ideal entry point, because this is even more accessible than something like Count Dracula. Mm-hmm. So I would start with that. Then I'd go to the sadistic Baron von Klaus, also in '62, mostly because, like I mentioned, it's the first giallo. It's a whodunit murder mystery, so it's kind of fun to try and figure out. And then after that, there's the Diabolical Dr. Zedd, made in 1966. This is a really important film to watch because, in addition to it being a gothic black and white sci-fi revenge film, this is also one of the first films to have a pretty strong infusion of the eroticism that he would become known for later. So it's a fun film to watch for that development. After that, in 1969, there was a film he made called Marquis de Sade's Justine, that starred Claus Kinski as the Marquis de Sade, and Jack Palance, of all people. He shows up. And then, of course, there's Venus and Furs, which we talked about. There's Count Dracula, Vampiros Lesbos. There's also a couple of other films from the 70s. One of them is called Eugenie, the story of her journey into perversion. And this is a fun film, mostly because of the behind-the-scenes shenanigans that went on, because Christopher Lee is in this film, but this might be an example of how a film was shot during the day with Christopher Lee, and then at night, Christopher Lee was given some things to do and say, so he didn't really know like what he was being a part of. But so he's in the film, and his scenes really stand out because they have nothing to do with what's going on in the movie. And then the film itself is this really, really, really sexy and very smart kind of cat and mouse thriller. And when Christopher Lee found out what he was in, he sort of severed ties with Jess Franco. At least for a little bit. Another film I'd recommend is Eugenie De Sade, which is basically his version of Lolita. This film stars Soledad Miranda, and it's really a lot of fun. There's also She Killed in Ecstasy. This is a film that he made right after Vampiros Lesbos with the same cast. So it's a bit jarring at the beginning because because I think literally Soledad Miranda, who was a villain in Vampiros Lesbos, is now the hero, whereas the actress who played Linda Westinghouse, she's the villain in this one. And then the last two films that I would recommend came out in 1973, and these are what I would call his more Terrence Malick style movies. There's a film called A Virgin Among the Living Dead, also known as Christina, Princess of Eroticism. And this is a really, really beautiful film, and almost a film worthy of its own podcast, just because this was made right after Soledad Miranda died. And you could sort of tell that this film is sort of meant to be a requiem for her, because there's an actress playing a role that I would imagine Soledad Miranda would have been cast in. And really beautiful shot at the end where, you know, she dies, and then they all, like her and her family, sort of walk into this marshland and just sort of sink below the surface of the water. It's a lot more beautiful than I'm making it sound, but I would check that out. And then, of course, the last one would be the Bear-Breasted Countess, also known as Female Vampire, which is probably the most innocuous title ever. But this would probably be a great film to end on if you were going through all his films from the Golden Age. This is a movie about its narrative is very thin. It's very much a film guided by mood and atmosphere as opposed to a narrative, but it's about a woman on an island in Greece, and she's the last of her kind, and the only way she's able to sustain herself is through gorging on the fluids of her victims. So depending on what version of the film you're watching, the R-rated version, those fluids are blood, and then the X-rated version, well, I'll leave it at your imagination. So yeah, I mean, those would probably be the 12 that I would start with. As you mentioned, some of them are available on streaming services. Most of these were put out by Kino Lorber, and I believe that Kino Lorber has their own streaming site now called Kino Now.
Yes.
And all the Jess Franco, and including all the Jean Rollin films, are on there. So for those of you looking to maybe save some money, because these things can get a little pricey if you buy them on Blu-ray, they're mostly all on Kino, with the exception of maybe one or two. So yeah, go out, check them out, you know, let us know what you think.
Okay. Well, Matthew, thank you very much for not only joining me today, but for introducing me to the world of Jess Franco. I am looking forward to seeing more of those films as I go along through the years. The ones that I watched definitely piqued my interest in looking at more of those films that you just listed. I appreciate the conversation today, and I'm glad that you brought Franco to my to my attention, and that we were able to talk about him today.
Oh yeah, and I'm glad you took on this challenge, and it's always fun to talk about Jess Franco. I mean, you know, as big a body of his work that he has, I still feel he's still a bit of a cult figure, even within the world of cult figures, because, you know, he's not necessarily as well known as, let's say, a Dario Argento or a Mario Bava. But, you know, again, he's one of these filmmakers who's really worth the time that it takes to watch his films. And I guess I'll leave you with one final bit of trivia on Jess Franco. I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but just to show you how well regarded he is by his fellow filmmakers, Orson Welles actually hired Jess Franco to be his assistant director on Don Quixote. So I believe also one of his films, Succubus, was called by Fritz Lang as the most erotic film he's ever seen, which I'm not sure about that, because, you know, when you think of eroticism, Fritz Lang is the first person who comes to mind.
Yeah.
But anyway, just to show you, like, he is well regarded, and I just wish more people knew about him, and if we were able to help expose him and introduce him to some more people, I'm one happy pappy.
But yeah, thank you very much for joining me today, Matthew.
Oh, absolutely. Take care there.
I'd like to thank Matthew for joining me today, as well as once again introducing me to the world of Jess Franco. I am looking forward to digging more into his films as the years go on. That's it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. It might be our last one of the year. Might try to get another one in. We'll see. But thank you very much for joining me this year. 2021 is hopefully going to be a better year in general. But as far as the podcast goes, we're going to be continuing to work on the last few episodes of the Class of 1999 series, which I'm looking forward to getting to, as well as some other topics. And we might do some 20-year retrospectives on some 2001 films too, because that was a pretty fantastic year as well. Thank you very much for joining me at the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Subscribe at Google, Apple, or Spotify. And that's it for this time. This is Brian Scuttle, and thank you for joining me as always at www.sonic-cinema.com.